empty out your savings accounts, that's how you do it, right?
Yeah. Tax money. You get,
Sure.
they can tax liquor, and the government desperately needed the money.
Outstanding. That's so interesting. And I want to get to the women's issue again. That's the theme so far is women's rights. But one of the reasons, I didn't know this until you illuminated it, was that behind the 18th Amendment was for public health to protect women from domestic violence. And so the 18th Amendment bans alcohol, and then the 21st Amendment repeals it. And women's rights is in a completely different place, because in the 19th Amendment, all of a sudden women have the right to vote or are more political equals. So it's a really interesting, it's kind of an interesting, and you can see how the 18th Amendment did set the table for some things to perhaps resolve themselves. Jennifer, thank you so much.
Yes.
Bill Prince, once again, just to and before I get to Bill, I'm sure Bill doesn't mind waiting. I want to remind you guys, I don't know if I said this at the top, I want to reiterate it. We're going to go through each of our panelists, and then we're really going to open the floor. We want to take about 15, 20 minutes. We can continue talking among ourselves, but if we can take some questions about the Constitution, about any questions you may have about current events with this document or the history of this document, this is the time to do it. Bill, could you tell us something that really interests you about the Constitution you want to raise awareness of that perhaps most Americans would be aware of?
Oh, as my class knows and can tell you, I'm kind of a Constitution geek. I love the Constitution, and I always tell them I wish our government class was 32 weeks long so that we could, we could spend. Can you guys hear me back there?
Thumbs up or thumbs down in the back for Bill?
Is this on?
Oh, I got some thumbs down.
I think our battery. Is that better?
There you go. There we go.
You're just booming down there.
There's a sweet spot.
Yeah, it doesn't even sound like we're making noise. But anyway, I wish the class was about 32 weeks long, because there is so much in the Constitution. And as my class will tell you, probably willfully, oh God, he's going to spend more time talking about the First Amendment and all that kind of stuff. But the things that I find fascinating about the Constitution are many. One of which is that this is a document that I think was born out of conflict and not consensus. It was a document, we oftentimes, I think, have visions of our founding fathers as this sort of homogenous group of people who were, dead set on getting the British out of here. And then once that was done, all was good. We sang Hakuna Matata and went on. And we know that that's not the case, that this document was born out of a lot of controversy and consensus. And I went to the internet where everything is true, right? And I found Constitution facts. What is it they say at BuzzFeed? You won't believe number 6. But anyway, I just found one that of the 55 delegates attending the Constitutional Convention, 39 signed, only 39 signed, 3 delegates dissented. 2 of America's founding fathers didn't sign the Constitution at all. Thomas Jefferson was representing his country in France, and John Adams was doing the same in Great Britain. But, this document came out of a lot of turmoil. Slaves versus no slaves, big states versus small states, states' rights versus the strong federal government. And I think what we ended up with was a document that was made out of, I sometimes refer to it as flexible concrete. It really kind of set forth what our government's supposed to look like, but there's wiggle room there. What I think makes our country great is not necessarily this document in and of itself. We I think, have 3 parts that make our country great. One is the Constitution. 2 is the rule of law. And you guys know rule of law is this idea that those who make the laws and enforce the laws should be bound by the same laws that they make and enforce. And I think that sort of creates a social fabric that we all have. So I think all these things go into making our country and our Constitution the unique thing that it is. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that again, I think there's a common misperception that once this document was signed, sealed, and delivered, once the Bill of Rights were created, attached, and signed, that that was it. Everything was great, and we know that's not the case. And again, my day job, I work with juveniles all day long, and this year, 2017, is the 50th anniversary of a famous Supreme Court case called N. Ray Galt. Has anybody here ever heard of the N. Ray Galt case?
N. Ray Galt.
N. Ray Galt, G-A-U-L-T. Rose has probably heard of it because she took criminal law. But as recently as 50 years ago, this is a 1967 case, not 1867 or 1767. You know, in as recently as 1967, if you were a juvenile in the United States, you could be arrested by the police, taken to jail. Your parents didn't have to be notified. You didn't have to be notified of what charges were levied against you. You were taken to a courtroom where you met with a judge. You didn't have a right to an attorney. You didn't have a right to a trial by jury. In the Galt case, it involved a young man who was accused of making an obscene telephone call, some heavy breathing to a neighbor. And anybody want to guess what his sanction was for that? 5 years in the Arizona State Department of Juvenile Corrections. Had that youth been 18 years of age, the maximum penalty would have been a $1,000 fine and possibly 30 days in jail. So you're looking at me funny.
Why would that be? Why would there be such a big discrepancy?
Because the concept of due process, which we talk so much about in the 14th Amendment, had, again, one of these flexible, concrete things. The words due process have been in our Constitution forever. How due process has been applied to citizens in this country has changed and wavered over the years. And so, again, as recently as 50 years ago, juveniles didn't have due process in this country. And so I just think it's interesting that even though we have these concepts that we talk about, due process, equal protection of the law, and those kinds of things, these are concepts that are continually evolving, continually changing, and I would contend, and I guess I'll be the controversial person here, continually under attack.
In what way?
Anytime that, and again, I don't want to get too political here, but anytime that you have somebody who touts an individual who racially profiles individuals based on their ethnicity as being law and order, I find that to be disingenuous. That is, you know, again, our Constitution talks about, you know, you can stop people if you have probable cause to believe that they have committed an offense, or you can stop somebody and search their car or their house if you have gone to court and presented evidence of probable cause that there's an offense. We have long, I think, you know, held this belief that we shouldn't stop people based simply on what they look like. And so when you have people commending people for being quote unquote law and order, for being at least anti-constitution in my mind, this just shows you the challenges that this document continues to present in 2017.
Well, you know, Bill, is it just me, or does it often seem like the people in our society from all political stripes who attack the Constitution the most are the folks waving it the loudest? It always seems to be like, you see this from a lot of folks who would live and die by the Constitution. They are morally indignant on any idea to change this thing, but couldn't wait to get rid of, especially in our current age of like immigration rhetoric, talk about repealing the 14th Amendment. And it's a really interesting dynamic where you have a whole lot of folks in our society screaming, leave the Constitution alone, except for the parts that I want to get rid of. And it's just kind of an interesting political environment, would you not say, or am I off base?
No, I agree, and it's a great document, particularly those parts you agree with, right?
Right.
Yeah. The parts we disagree with, well, we maybe want to do something, do something else with them. But you know, years ago, I'm really dating myself, and I always quote this to my classes. But there was a play written called Finian's Rainbow, and one of the characters in Finian's Rainbow was sort of a stereotypical bigoted Southern senator. And he was engaging in some discriminatory behavior, and somebody said, "Well, sir, that's unconstitutional." And his response was, "Unconstitutional? I'm too busy defending the Constitution. I don't have time to read it." And so I think a lot of us are that way. You know, we think we know what certain things in the Constitution say, and we act on that when really that's not what the Constitution says at all.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, we're going to move on to another panelist. I do want to remind you, here in about 10 minutes, here in about 10, 15 minutes, we would love to open the floor to involve you guys in the conversation. If there's a couple ideas you have in your head that you kind of want to flesh out with us, please ask us a question, make a statement. We'll do what we can to bounce back to you in some way that's satisfying for the crew that is here in the room. But moving on, again, back to a history type angle. Greg French, again, teaches history here. Could you tell us something, I guess, about the history of the Constitution that most Americans probably wouldn't know?
Absolutely. So when I got to thinking about this, I'm kind of different from everybody else on this panel in that there's two political scientists and then an American historian. I predominantly teach world history, and so my first inclination was to think of the Constitution from a global perspective. I wanted to see what I could find there, and the thing I arrived at was looking at the Constitution as a set of ideas, right, which it inherently is, a set of different ideas. And I'm glad that you gave the example of the pilgrims showing up, bringing their beer with them, right? When people travel, they bring things with them, whether it's beer, their religion, right? We talk about the founding of America, they're fleeing persecution in England, right? They want to practice their religion openly. That's an idea they bring with them. They bring disease with them, right? This is a process we call in world history the Columbian exchange, right? Exchange of goods, peoples, ideas, anything. And so what I want to talk about today is the Constitution being a product of this exchange of ideas on a global scale. The Constitution as a product of globalization. And I told Andrew this morning, we share an office together, and I kind of scared him. I said, I'm going to talk about 4th century Persia. And I'm going to do that when I talk about the Constitution. And he said, I told him not to worry about it. But he has been. So I want to talk about the Constitution in the context of 4th century Iran. Okay? So let's go to Iran.
4th century Iran?
Iran.
Okay.
Yes, Persia, as it was called. And there's a prophet who emerges. His name is Mani. And he emerges in Persia, right time and place, geographically a perfect location. You know about Iran, if you look at it on a map, it sits in a perfect place. Dominates a plateau, the Iranian plateau, which descends down to India, and the civilizations of India, and then on to China. To the west, the Anatolian Peninsula, and Europe. Okay, so it's right along the Silk Road, right? You guys have heard of the Silk Road, right? A famous passageway of ideas, not just silk, right? People travel on it, they bring with them their beliefs, their ideas. Mani is influenced by several of them. Okay? He is influenced by, from the east, Buddhism, and from the west, Christianity, and from Iran itself, an ideology known as Zoroastrianism. And what Mani does is he takes these ideas, synthesizes them, puts them together in what becomes a unique, coherent ideology that becomes known as Manichaeism, which is a new faith that takes what it likes from Christianity and from Hinduism and all these other faiths and makes it its own thing. And it emerges along this trade routes, which is a perfect place to have ideas because people travel and they take these things with them. So I started to think of the Constitution in this way. And you look at the Constitution, you look at America in the 18th century, sitting astride a trade route in a perfect location. America participates in the trade routes of the Atlantic world, connecting Europe with Africa and the Caribbean and South America. Look at the ideas inherent in the Constitution. You have ideas from classical Greece and Rome in terms of republicanism and early democracy. You have ideas from the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. I look at the Constitution from a global perspective. I see Jean-Jacques Rousseau from France and the principle of popular sovereignty, that power resides in the people. I see the Baron de Montesquieu and the concept of the separation of powers. I look at John Locke and the idea of natural rights, and Adam Scott and his ideas on the economy from Scotland. So for me, the Constitution represents that same train of events that happens in 4th century Iran, which is the emergence of a synthesis of ideas along trade routes that becomes a unique document. Okay, so for me, that's what the Constitution represents. If we take what is best from the European Enlightenment, classical Greece and Rome, and turn it into a document that is uniquely American, I think we could all argue that it's uniquely American while at the same time retaining those syncretic influences. So that was the theme I came up with.
Well, there's whole parts of the Constitution, like parts of the First Amendment that were borrowed from Europe. I mean, it's really surprising how much the Constitution is, a common misperception. That's really what this panel is all about. A common misperception about the Constitution is this idea that it was an American invention. But really, we kind of just cobbled together, like you said, spare parts from previous codes and law books and and policies from world, not just American history, but world history.
Absolutely. And so yes, we take European ideas, classical Greek and Roman ideas, but they work in the American setting. I look at the French Constitution of 1791, the early revolution. So just September 1789, the Constitution is approved. By that time, France is 2 months into its own revolution. Okay, the king has been forced to sign a law limiting its powers. France is now beginning its slide down into the terrors of the 1790s. And as Bill mentioned, Thomas Jefferson is there.
In France.
In Paris at the same time. And he is asked by the Marquis de Lafayette, who you might know from American Revolutionary history, a general, comes over and serves under Washington. He's asked by Lafayette to help because the French have never had a Republican-style government. And Jefferson, the author of the Declaration and a primary influence on the Constitution, writes the French Declaration of Independence, Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, influences the development of the French Constitution. But in France, it doesn't work. France is now on its 5th Constitution. Since 1789, we've had 1. So you take these ideas, it's the same set of ideas. They don't work in France initially. Now they've been developed there and they're working okay now. They don't work in Latin America when the Latin American republics rebelled in the early 19th century. Mexico's gone through several constitutions, Bolivia, Venezuela, all the independent former Spanish colonies have this problem. All motivated by the same group of people, but it's the uniqueness of the American experience that makes it work here.
You know, and that's something that the more and more you read about other worlds, other countries and their constitution. I don't think other planets have come up with constitutions yet. I would love to read like the Constitution of Titan, you know, Saturn moon or whatever. But when you read about other countries having their own constitutions, and as you know, every state, of course, has its own constitution. The vast majority of these states have rewritten their constitution. Missouri itself is on to its 4th constitution. Missouri is currently on its 4th. It was only written in 1945. So that's a lot of upheaval for a state. And then entire nations, like you said, France, what we typically think of as a very modern, enlightened country, has rewritten its constitution over and over again. How we've gotten away, really, with just this one constitution, I know it's replacing the Articles of Confederation, but still, how this one document that's only, what would you say, 12 pages long, depending on your font size, how it's governed a country of this size and dynamism and change, is one of the things that really makes it extraordinary.
Absolutely. It's something that I think sets apart all of these experiences. The American colonies are separated from England by thousands of miles of ocean, and they're more or less forced to fend for themselves. The king is nominally in charge, he appoints a governor, but colonial assemblies elected by generally landowning white males of those colonies run the colonies. So very early on, the American colonies develop a tradition of self-government that they become very protective of. 1689, James II tries to take those rights away. There are revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic against that. 1764, they start passing all these laws, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the train of events that leads to breaking away. And the English, for their, all their enlightened ideas that they have, cannot figure out why we are so mad about all these things. And it's the 200 plus years of self-government that the colonies have. So when we do become independent, with a few bumps along the way, we have an idea of how to make this work in such a large expanse. So the uniqueness of the American colonial experience, I think, is what sets us apart from either France or Venezuela or Mexico or any of these other places.
And I really want to piggyback on an idea that you just mentioned, and it's the idea that we've had significant bumps in the road, obviously, and America fell flat on its face governmentally several times. I mean, in the first 10 years, the Articles failed, and the country almost ripped itself apart in the 1860s. The American Constitution is an amazing document, but one thing I really want to keep in mind is that especially in this day and age, when more and more countries are flirting with the idea of democracy across the world, their democracies that will be created will be huge messes for a long, long period of time, like ours was. And just think of that when you look at countries embracing democracy. Don't look down your nose at them and saying, well, they can't get it right like we can in the enlightened West. You really got to give them a century or two to get their act together, because we needed a century or two to get our act together. Thank you so much. What I would like to do at this point is I'm fascinated to know if anybody